like new, sensational, commercial, aberrational. Just take your pick, the Merc, the Trib Examiner, or the Chronicle. Just take your pick, the Merc, the Trib Examiner, or the Chronicle. Oh, give us some yuppie stuff, upscale and puffy stuff, features on pasta and crab. Whenever we eat, we dine, always a hip chick time. Life without sushi's a drag. We like to make our stories brief, concise, and short. Each news release don't tax their minds, is our belief. A thinking brain gives too much grief. Don't tax their minds, is our belief. A thinking brain gives too much grief.
Hello, I'm Ben Bagdikian, and I'd like to talk about some newspaper myths. And I think the San Francisco Bay Area is an ideal stage to demonstrate some of the fallacies that are cherished by newspaper publishers and by a lot of journalists. The myth number one is a cruel one. It says that cities deserve the newspapers they get, that a newspaper would fail if it didn't reflect the needs and wants of the population, and that if it failed, of course, the new paper would come in and would be closer to the people it serves. It's a nice idea, and it seems perfectly reasonable, but it happens to be wrong. San Francisco has one of the highest demographics of any major city in the country. People are better educated than in most cities, higher incomes, and they're more liberal than almost any urban population in the country. And it would seem to follow, I suppose, that as a result, the San Francisco papers would be extremely sophisticated in their news, comprehensive and serious about national, international, and local news, and that they would be very liberal. Right? Wrong. The San Francisco papers have been notorious for decades for being very low in their journalistic quality and ranging from conservative to reactionary. And that is not peculiar to the San Francisco area. It's simply more dramatic because of the difference between what the population is like and what the papers are like. And we see that there are papers in places like Louisville, Kentucky, and Providence, Rhode Island, not great centers of world culture and sophistication, that have very good newspapers. And we have papers in sophisticated cities like San Francisco that have had poor newspapers for a long time. And that leads us to the conclusion that the newspaper that a city gets is almost entirely a matter of chance of who owns the paper and what this owner perceives to be his or her self-interest. Then why is it that the paper doesn't fail? The San Francisco Chronicle, which is the leading paper in San Francisco, has been extremely capricious in its news, including national and international news. A little better lately. It has been part of the laughingstock in American journalism for its devotion to fun and games and fantasy and weirdo kinds of stories. It is an extremely conservative paper in a city that is steadily very liberal in its politics, and yet it's extremely successful financially. And why does that happen? Well, first of all, almost all American papers give minimal attention, but a minimum at any rate, to melodramatic national and international news. So that if you are cruising page one on the way to the sports section or the comics page, you do see whether the world is still in one piece as you go through to the less important news. But also, there is another basic reason, and that is that most of a newspaper's money comes from the advertisers, not to the people who buy the paper. The advertising in an American paper provides over 75% of the revenues, and that's the group that has to be satisfied. Now, naturally, the paper needs readers because otherwise the advertisers won't buy ads. And so they do need some readers, and they put out a number of things in the average paper that have nothing to do with serious news. There's the comic strips. There's the stock market report. There are sports scores. There is advice to the lovelorn. There are all kinds of things that are technological and mechanical, have nothing to do with real live reporting, and which are useful to people, if for no other reason that people will get their daily TV listings out of the daily paper. So that people don't buy a paper solely for the news, but they do want some news. But they will forgive a paper being shoddy in its news if the paper serves these other interests. So that your paper can get away with having shoddy news, and many papers in this country do. And furthermore, the public has no choice. There are 1,700 daily papers in the United States, and in 98% of newspaper cities, there's a local monopoly. And when you have a local monopoly, you can get away with a great deal because people have no choice. And in San Francisco, there's not a technical monopoly because there's another paper in the city. The Chronicle is alone in the morning, and there's the San Francisco Examiner in the afternoon. Now, they've had very different histories, and they used to compete, but they don't really compete much anymore. The Chronicle, in its devotion to fun and games and sending reporters to Tanzania to buy a slave, as they did years ago, or reporting on mythical man-beasts in the Oregon woods, which they in the Examiner used to do regularly, and similar hijinks, at least comes by it honestly. It was started after the American Civil War as an entertainment review. San Francisco is a wild and woolly place, and editors used to solve their differences frequently by gunfire. Editors who disagreed with each other tended to challenge each other to duels, and there were a lot of those, or they beat up their opponents on the sidewalk, or they shot them. But the Chronicle, for many decades, had been second to the Examiner. The Examiner, of course, is notable for having been William Randolph Hearst's first great success in the newspaper business. He took it over when he was a 24-year-old college dropout and turned it into a spectacularly successful paper in terms of money-making. It was sensationalist, and of course that's what the history books talk about, and it was sensationalist, and it was sleazy in lots of ways, and had a lot of so-called yellow journalism. But it had something else that the history books don't talk about so much, and that is that at that stage in his life, William Randolph Hearst was a socialist, and the paper spoke for the working class and better working conditions and housing conditions for the poor, and gathered much of its original support from working people. It became, eventually, the leading paper in San Francisco. Now, William Randolph Hearst changed. He became extremely conservative. His papers were frozen in the early 20th century, and the Hearst chain was well known for having local publishers who waited for word from the Hearst castle on what to do, and they lost touch with the American people. The Hearst papers became more and more reactionary, more and more idiosyncratic, but in San Francisco, the Examiner was so established that it was the most powerful paper in the city. It said that in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that the police department and City Hall waited to find out whether their next move would be approved by the Examiner before they made the next move. And the Chronicle was a poor second to the Examiner. And then in mid-1960s, something interesting happened. The Chronicle started creeping up on the Examiner, but the Examiner was still ahead. So the owners of the Examiner and the owners of the Chronicle got together in a hotel room in San Francisco, and they came out as business partners. They decided that they would no longer compete with each other in a business way, but that they would, while keeping independent newsrooms, continue to work together in a business way. They would print together in a separate company, and then what happened was Hearst gave up its dominance in the morning field, went to the afternoon, and a kind of death wish for any newspaper in a modern city, and the Chronicle became the leading paper in the morning, and therefore, being a morning monopoly, it has made lots of money. They divide their profits 50-50, and so while they technically have competition, it's competition with a leash. Neither business partner is really going to hurt the other, and they have formed a powerful advertising monopoly in the whole area, and they are comfortable with each other. The Examiner has frozen in its circulation at less than a third of the Chronicles, and so the public doesn't have a choice, and that's why the papers can be very different from the needs and wants of the people in San Francisco, but they can still make a great deal of money.
So what newspaper do you read?
The Examiner, San Francisco.
What do you like about it?
There's really nothing to dislike or like about it. It's just one of the newspapers that comes to my house, so I read it.
The San Francisco Chronicle. Basically, I've been reading it for a long time. It's more force of habit than anything.
I read it because after I listen to the news in the morning, I read it to kind of get a weird slant on what I heard.
And I also like the Macy's section in the Sunday Chronicle, the Macy's California Living.
Examiner.
What do you like about it?
In general, I like it. Good sports. I'm a sportsman.
They're about the same because they're from the same house, you know. So the staff, they're not trying to be that much different than one another. So they don't have much to say.
Most paper I like to read is the Chronicle.
What do you like about it most?
Herb Kane. I like the green sheet. And I liked some of the articles I read about.